It is a treat to welcome to Steamboat Springs Dr. Victor Davis Hanson. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I thought I'd speak about 35 minutes on deterrence and welcome your questions. You know, what is deterrence was best summed up, I think, by an obscure 18th century British parliamentarian named George Savile, and he was the first Earl of Halifax. And he said, "We in Britain don't hang horse thieves because they steal horses. We hang them so other people don't steal horses." And I think what he meant, translated, is the United States doesn't go all the way over to Kuwait in 1991 just to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait, but so other countries don't keep doing what he did. Or people in Britain did not want to go to war over Czechoslovakia per se, but so that Hitler did not dismember people and countries like the Czechs and Czechoslovakia. And that's the essence of what deterrence is. One way to remember about it, it has an evil twin called appeasement. Deterrence is basically you try to force somebody to do something that he otherwise does not want to do. We do it in our own lives. You have children that you deter, and you have children that you appease. Notice the etymology. Deterrence is from the Latin terreo, to terrify somebody from something. If you have a child and you say, "Do not come back after 11 or else," or you can try appeasement, which is from the Latin word pax, pacify. I want to explain to you why it would be not in our family interest if you came after 11. But if you did come after 11, I'd want to be in your place and understand where you're coming from. That's appeasement. Now, before we go into the historical ramifications of it, there's 3 or 4 things to remember about deterrence and appeasement. The first thing is everybody hates the deterrer and they love the appeaser, because the appeaser always guarantees short-term peace. We've seen that with President Obama. He calls it smart diplomacy. Each time an incident arises, he diffuses the situation. It's almost like stopping up a steam boiler. It's going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, but it does not explode on your watch. The greatest appeaser in Britain before World War II was Stanley Baldwin, Prime Minister who left office in 1937, followed by another appeaser, Neville Chamberlain. British people loved him because during the Saarland crisis, the Rhine crisis, the impending Anschluss that came after his watch, he guaranteed Britons that there was no need to revisit the Somme and Verdun. In contrast, Winston Churchill said, "We don't have enough RAF squadrons. This new Spitfire needs to get up to 1,500 units. We've got to build 2 more battleships. We need 2 more. We can't trust Herr Hitler." And they said, "This man is a warmonger, and he wants to revisit the Somme. We lost 1 million soldiers when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and we do not want this man in power again." Ditto, Chamberlain said almost the same thing. The appeaser is always beloved by the population. The deterrer is always hated. Second thing to remember about deterrence is it's not necessarily predicated just on military power, but military power plus the likelihood that somebody will use it. When Hitler invaded France on May 10th of 1940, he'd been at war since September 1st, 1939 in Eastern Europe. His generals had come to him and they said, "Are you crazy? The British and the French and even the Dutch and the Belgians among them have 4 million men. The Char tank has a 75 millimeter gun. French fighters and Spitfires are superior or at least as good as ME-109s. We can't defeat this. We couldn't do it. We only went 80 miles in World War I. Why would we want to do it again?" And Hitler said, "You don't understand. They won't fight. They've lost their morale. They're teaching in their schools that Verdun was a catastrophe. not a great victory. They're socialist. And then he also referenced, and other Nazis did, in 1936, the Oxford Debating Society said under no circumstances would they ever fight for king and country. So they're a paper tiger. And so he was not deterred despite all of that military and formidable military. When he went into Czechoslovakia, Hitler said, "Oh my God, I'm glad that nobody called my bluff. I didn't understand how much superior the Skoda Arms Works were to our own arms industry, and I didn't have any idea about Czech fortifications that make our west wall look like a joke." But it's very important, if you're going to maintain deterrence, that the person to be deterred or the nation to be deterred does not quite know what you'll do at any given time. Suicidal is to ensure people that you're sober and rational and you would never use the assets at your command. Third thing to remember about deterrence is that it's very, very hard to incrementally establish, and it's very, very easy to abandon. And once it's abandoned, it's almost impossible to get it back without a war. Jimmy Carter was beloved 1977, 78, 79. And what did he do? He slashed defense, but more importantly, he said the following: "I have no inordinate fear of communism. All of our human rights issues will adjudicate our entire foreign policy. Not one soldier will die on my watch. I will sell F-15s to Saudi Arabia, but they will not have bomb racks on them, I guarantee that." And in that process, so incrementally and insidiously was he giving the message that people and nations could take advantage of him. And when Reagan came in, even though Carter had established the Carter Doctrine, increased the defense budget, people demonized Reagan, and it took him 3 to 4 years to restore deterrence. After Stanley Baldwin left office in 1937, Neville Chamberlain came in from 1937 to May 10th, the day that France was invaded. They got rid of him, of course. Churchill's presence in the cabinet, Churchill's entrance into the prime ministership was too late. It was too late to restore deterrence. It took World War II and the aftermath to recover it. So try to remember that, a third thing about deterrence. And the fourth is the person who is appeased, the head of state who is appeased, usually detests the person who appeased him. After Munich, Neville Chamberlain gave the entire European game over to Hitler. He basically said, take over not only the Sudetenland, but you can take over Bohemia and Moravia, and Czechoslovakia won't exist. And he had an empire which is it's the greatest extent that we've ever seen German speakers have in the history of Germany. Chamberlain did all that. And what did he say to Hermann Goering and Ribbentrop after he saw Chamberlain? He said, if that little stupid man ever comes back with his umbrella and meddles in my affairs, I'm going to jump up and step on him. Does anybody believe? Nobody has been nicer to Vladimir Putin under reset than Barack Obama. Vladimir Putin detests Barack Obama. So do the Athenian theocrats, because they feel that either he has no consistency, or he doesn't think like they do, or he doesn't represent the government of the United States. I'll give you an anecdote off the record. The Chinese government once in a while sends their press attaché to berate columnists who have been unfair, they feel, to the Republic of China. A young woman came, very attractive woman, about 30, came to see me. The Hoover Institution said, we don't feel that your columns on China are correct. And of course, she had tight jeans, boots, all these gifts, which I had to explain to her that I could not accept. And anyway, we started arguing and arguing and arguing. And after about an hour, she said, turned off her little tape recorder and said, can I talk to you a minute off the record? And I said, yes. She said, what is it with Obama? Every leader tries to protect their own interest. He's not protector, and he lets us do this, he lets North Korea do this, he lets Iran do this. Why is he doing this? We think there's a plot. We don't like him. And I said, what is the plot? He thinks he wants to draw us in, and he's going to clamp the American trap on us. And I said, promises, promises. It's not going to happen. But the point I'm getting at is she represented a contempt for somebody who had been nice to them. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean from history. We all remember the Persian Wars in 480. The Greeks Well, we should. We're in the 21st century, so let me rephrase that. Nobody knows what the Persian Wars were. But if we did, King Xerxes, in the largest amphibious operation until D-Day, was defeated by a motley group of 31 city-states, 480 BC. You know the name Thermopylae and Salamis, Plataea. 250,000 people. Fast forward 150 years later. The Greek city-state in 360 BC has got another threat from the north. Philip of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great. He doesn't have an army of 250. He's only got 30,000. But for 20 years, he's got a great propaganda. I'm here to protect you. I want to be part of the international community. We've got to pay the Persians back. I respect your traditions. And incrementally and insidiously, in 20 years, he did with 30,000 what Xerxes could never do. Why was it? Were the Greeks poor? Did they have less triremes, fewer hoplites? No. They didn't know what Greece was, and they didn't know what it stood for. They weren't ready to fight an abstraction, and they dealt with someone who they appeased rather than deterred, as the great statesman Demosthenes said. If you think again to return to Hitler before World War II, what happened? As I said, the Allies got smart after 33, and they started really arming in an astounding fashion. Once Baldwin went out in 37, it was late, but they were starting to get to a point where they were superior to Hitler. But each time he did something, don't go into the Rhineland, it's part of the Versailles Treaty, and he did, and people said, well, the Versailles Treaty, John Maynard Keynes, etc., said it was very mean. It caused all these people, so let's just call it quits and he'll like us and stop. And then he had a plebiscite at the Saar. Well, he's not supposed to influence voters and intimidate them, but you know what? The Saarland has always been part of Germany. We should have never made it an independent entity anyway. And then they said, well, now he wants to unite Austria. And they tried to do that right after Versailles. We said, you can't do that. But you know what? They do speak German. President Obama thought they spoke Austria, but they still and do and always will speak German. So there were people in the West, in France and Britain, and said, well, you know, it's Germany, so what? And once we give them the Anschluss, that will be it. Then, of course, later, 12 months later, it was, well, we have German minorities in Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia didn't exist as an entity. Hermann Goering said it's a lousy people, a lousy country. So let's just carve off the border with Germany and give it, and that'll be it at Munich. And they did. And then he took Moravia, as I said, in Bohemia, and it ceased to exist. And then it was time for Poland, and they said, we're going to draw the line at Poland. And the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, are looking at this, and they're saying, who do we want to ally with? We don't trust Hitler, and indeed he would invade them in 1941 on June 22nd. But these people are weak, so we're going to throw our lot in with Hitler and the non-aggression pact, and you know what history followed, that they divided Poland and World War II started. But at each step of the process, the sober, the judicious, the calm statesmen in Britain and France were praised for bringing peace to their time, and the loudmouths like Churchill or Amory or any of those great people, Duff Cooper, were demonized as warmongers who wanted to revisit the battlefields of World War I. If we look at our own situation in the United States, I think it's a general rule that any time we have lost deterrence, whether material deterrence or psychological deterrence, a war has followed. I'll just give you a few examples. Why did the Japanese attack on December 7th? Well, it's not quite what people think that they had. They should have attacked in 39 and 40, 41. But if we read what they said rather than what we say they said, they thought that the United States' greatest ally in the war was Britain, and from September 1 to December 7th, they had no problem with watching London go up in flames. So the Japanese militarists said, you know what? These people did not want to go over and help Britain, so if we just do a lightning attack at Pearl Harbor and wipe out their fleet, maybe we'll catch the carriers. They didn't, but they thought they would. They will sue for peace. And then there is all of these orphan islands that there's no colonial powers. France doesn't exist. We'll take over Southeast Asia. They did. Netherlands doesn't exist. It's occupied by Germany. We'll get Java and Indonesia, etc. The Americans won't care. We'll have to take the Philippines from them, of course, but after all, they don't want to fight. That was a very wrong conclusion because, of course, public opinion went from 35% wanting to enter World War II to 95%. But the Japanese, it didn't matter, it was too late. The Japanese did not sense that from America. The Korean War, right after the war, we went from about 40% GDP down to almost 4%, completely disarmed. When the North Koreans invaded, we had to find Sherman tanks and 105 millimeters at parks that were on display to get them over to Korea. And remember that right before they invaded, not too long at the National Press Club, a great statesman, Dean Acheson, was asked, is Korea in the American defensive ring? He said, no, we don't have the resources to protect Korea. And that, along with the Soviet possession of the bomb, Stalin finally said, okay, I didn't want you people to invade the South, but they're ill-prepared. They say they're not going to fight. And they really did believe, especially when they got all the way down to Pusan, that we wouldn't fight. One last example, you could all think of your own, but why did Saddam go into Kuwait? It didn't make any sense. I mean, the only chance he had was to fight something in an asymmetrical fashion, as we saw in the Second Gulf War. But why fight in an open desert in a conventional World War II against the greatest military power in the world? And the answer, of course, is he didn't think we were going to do anything. He mentioned Vietnam, 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 said that ad nauseum. And then April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Iraq, was asked specifically in August of 1990, what's your attitude about Kuwait's theft of our oil and its pressuring us to pay the money we borrowed to conduct the Iran war when we were protecting the Sunni Arab world? And Ambassador Glaspie said, territorial disputes within the Arab world are none of the concern of the United States. And that was a green light to go in. And then we had to go restore deterrence by fighting a war, and on and on and on. So in our own history, we've had this problem. Now, what about the last 7 years? We've heard a lot of it. I think we could make the argument that whether Obama knew it or not, he lost U.S. deterrence. And he did it in 3 or 4 ways. The first was material. The defense budget, I think, is scheduled to be 3.2% of GDP in 2016. With sequestration and cuts, it may go down to 2.6. Now, the president laughs that off and he says, well, the fleet may be the size of World War I, but only a World War I mine, he said that to Romney, remember, would count assets, individual ships. And the tragic irony is that naval strategists are moving away from a big carrier platform, and they're trying to disperse our strength with a number of smaller ships. So having a lot of ships is becoming more important as it was in World War I. And he's cut the Marine Corps, he's cut the Army, he's cut defense appropriations. So the world is looking at that, and they understand that China, many countries in the Middle East, Iran, Russia, are spending more of their GDP. And when the president says, well, ideally we'd like to build down to just 500 nuclear weapons with Russia, then people in Taiwan, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, they say, wait a minute. I thought we had about 50 of those nukes to protect us, and 50 for him, and 50 for him, because in Obama's ethereal world, nobody would be so Neanderthal to count nuclear weapons except people in the real world, because they feel that they're under a defense umbrella. And nobody in the Obama administration ever said to Putin, we'll build down, we'll keep 1,500 because we have all of these dependencies and you don't have anybody, and you can go down to 500 if you want. But again, it sent the message to all of these different countries that the United States materially would not be able to defend them. And then we come to some more subtle but just as injurious decisions and acts that he made. Of course, the currency of the President of the United States is vastly eroded. If the president says to an Arab country, if we see some chemical weapons moving around, that would be a game changer, that would be nobody's going to believe that. If he says to Putin, after going into Georgia under the last year of the Bush administration, then into Crimea, then into eastern Ukraine. If you do this again, that would be a real step over line as far as we're concerned. No one's going to believe it. If he says to Iran, as he has on 5 occasions, you better stop enrichment by the UN summit, by the first of the year, by the G20, nobody in Iran believed that. And they were right not to believe it because they got a much better deal. So whether we like it or not, what we say now means nothing, and it's an invitation for aggression. There's a third thing that he did, I think, which was unwise. Teddy Roosevelt said, speak softly and carry a big stick. He did not say, speak loudly and obnoxiously and carry no stick at all. And that's what we're doing. I don't share Donald Trump's view of Vladimir Putin. I think he's a thug, of course, a possible murderer, a kleptocrat, always. But the point is that if you're not going to deter him, then don't insult him gratuitously. Don't say, well, you know, Putin is just like kind of a class cut-up, a guy that slouches in the back of the room. Or he's in kind of into a macho shtick. This is all for, why do you have to cycle on? Or, well, Putin really put his head in it. He went into the Middle East. That's going to be a quagmire for him. That would be like Churchill saying, don't worry about Hitler. He went into Poland. Now he's into France. He's going to be overextended. True in the abstract. In the concrete, thousands and millions of people are going to die to prove your point. Tell that to somebody in Western Ukraine. So Obama has a strange ability, whether it's Netanyahu or whoever it is, to insult them personally, but only to aggravate them, almost like poking a tiger when you're not sure the bars are that strong. It's really stupid. And then we come to his Orwellian use of language. Any terrorist worldwide knows that if he commits an act against a Western entity, or in general or in particular against the United States, Obama is going to do 2 things. He's not going to use the word Islamic terrorism, not even radical Islamic terrorism, and he's going to give a sermon to Americans not to take out their anger on the Muslim community. Or maybe at a Christian prayer breakfast, he will say, don't you Christians get on your high horse when you remember the Inquisition and the Crusades. Think about how far he has to go back to find something morally equivalent to what Islam's doing in the present. And then we have the euphemisms. Between Barack Obama and Clapper and Brennan, we were told that jihad is a personal odyssey. The Muslim Brotherhood's largely secular. Overseas contingency operations or anti-terrorism. Man-caused disasters or terror, workplace violence. That sent a message along with the lectures about Guantanamo. I think most people in the world who don't like us sort of feel a little bit deterred about Guantanamo. Well, they got this kind of gulag out there. They treat people very nice. That's what we do. But if they're so ashamed of it, then let's keep upping the propaganda to make them even more ashamed. So every time Obama apologizes or trashes George Bush or promises it'll be shut down, he also uses language to erode U.S. deterrence. And the result of all these multifaceted efforts by the president is, as in the case of Jimmy Carter, that annus terribilis of that 12-month period, remember, between 1979 and the end of his term in 1980, all of a sudden, the wonderful world, his approval rating was 58%. And all of a sudden, people said, this guy might not win re-election. That nut Reagan, who doesn't even want to get back the Panama Canal, is coming in. So we might as well cash in our chips. So the Russians went into Afghanistan, the Chinese invaded Vietnam, they got rid of the Shah, they took American hostages, there were communist insurrections in Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and it was sort of, let's get what we can while we can, because no president would be as stupid as this guy. And I'm afraid to say that we are entering another sphere, because whoever the president is, with the exception of Bernie Sanders, whether it's Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or Cruz or Rubio or whoever it is not going to continue the Obama policy because it's suicidal and they're going to have advisors. So the people abroad are going to say it's time to ratify, institutionalize, codify our aggressions. And I'd like to finish with just taking a brief panoramic view. What do I mean by the loss of deterrence? If you look at the place we're all worried about most, the Middle East, you would not recognize it from 2009. We forget that when Barack Obama entered office, the mortality rate in Iraq was less than the accident rate in the U.S. military. And by November, nobody was being killed in Iraq. Whatever you think about the Iraq War, it was starting to look like Korea 1954 or 55. Just imagine had Dwight E., let's say that Eisenhower, up for re-election in 56, had said, you know what, I didn't start the Korean War, Harry Truman did. And I'm going to get every American troop out of Korea. We've been there long enough. And pulled everybody out of Korea in 56. What do you think would have happened? You think there'd be Kia today or Samsung? No. That's what Obama did. He said, we're going to get every troop out. And then, remember what he said? Joe Biden said it could be our greatest achievement, the surge. The man who engineered it is now going to lose his 4th star, perhaps. So he said, I am leaving a Iraq that is self-reliant and secure. Exact words. And now we have no Iraq. It's chaos. It's part of a emerging caliphate. You can make fun and call the caliphate JVs. You can make fun of ISIS. You can say what you want, but they're medieval. And there's a long record in the past of other people doing what they do, and the end is not good. You could make fun of ISIS all you want in the way you made fun. Nobody thought that a Bavarian corporal would take control of the country of Goethe and Nietzsche, you know, and a great German tradition, yet they turned it over to Hitler. Nobody thought that he would have any ability to do anything other than to ruin Germany. So don't just make fun of ISIS, as Obama did, in the way he's made fun of other movements. Syria does no longer exist as a country. And I'm not blaming it on any particular president, but when you give a threat and then you don't follow through, chaos erupts. And when you don't want to find or see if they exist an alternative to Assad or ISIS, when we perhaps had an opportunity, we don't now. And the logical wage of that is 1 million refugees have gone into Europe to a pre-modern migration into a postmodern country. Remember H.G. Wells, the Morlocks and the Eloi? You've got Morlocks and the Eloi don't know how to deal with them. That's basically what Europe is. That's a result of this mess in Syria. I can see not wanting to support 100% an aging kleptocrat in Mubarak, but why did we turn over that, sell him out for the Muslim Brotherhood, whose whole agenda was one election, one time? So now we've achieved the impossible of having the former supporters of Mubarak, the military under Sisi, and the Muslim all hating us at once. Libya, there's no need to say anything. The logical trajectory of going out and bombing a monster in rehab and then violating the UN resolutions that you said that were so great, which were, too, remember, no-fly zone and humanitarian assistance. And then we started bombing and we said, you know, as Hillary said, thought that was cute. We came, we saw, Gaddafi died. You remember that phrase? The logical trajectory was Benghazi. If you look at Iran, I think everybody understands it's not a matter if, but when, and the when will be their choosing. Obama said it could be a legitimate regional power. He meant that seriously, and I think it will trigger an arms race. Saudi Arabia's got the highest percentage of GDP on defense in the world now. 17% of their GDP is going to defense, and they're either going to buy a bomb from Pakistan or make one, and we're going to have a mess in the Middle East. Obama will not be around, but there will be a mess. If you look at other places, it was mentioned this morning about the Spratly Islands, that group of about 750, mostly waterless, uninhabited atolls, but they're right on the trajectory from the Mediterranean in Europe to Japan, South China Sea. And imagine that we've had a precedent under Obama that any major country or minor country can just go out and claim an atoll and put a base on it and then say international waters extend 12 miles around it, and this is our airspace, where it's impossible for anybody to conduct commerce with this thing in the way. Imagine if we did that, or the British did that, or the Indians did that, the world would be chaotic. We wouldn't go to war over the Spratly Islands because of the Spratly Islands, but we might want to confront them to say that nobody can do that and have a sane post-war order the way we've had. If we look at Russia, Obama keeps saying to us, well, they're contained because the rest of the aggressive acts that he would consider involve NATO powers. But I think that's precisely like why he might go into Estonia, because does anybody believe with the financial catastrophe in Europe and the migration crisis that Europeans who spend about 1.5 on GDP and defense are going to rally like their sailors at Lepanto and say, don't go into Estonia? That's a red line. And if he did go to Estonia, and Obama would say, don't go there, that's a step over line, that's a deadline, that's a red line, and we're going to invoke Article 5, did anybody believe he would do it? Or if he did, it would mean anything? And if it didn't mean anything, wouldn't it mean the dissolution of NATO? And wouldn't that be a good thing as far as Vladimir Putin was concerned? So another reason why I think this is going to be a very dangerous year in the next 11 and a half months. If you look at Latin America, there used to be an idea, even under Clinton, George Bush, Reagan, the first Bush, that we were supporting people reform in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, free market economics, constitutional government. That's all gone. The president never gives any lecture other than to go down there and listen to Daniel Ortega for 30 minutes, trash the United States, and when he's all done, what did Obama say? Well, I wasn't old enough, don't blame me. In other words, he's distancing himself from the tradition of the United States. So South America is mostly, it's socialist, it's economically in a quagmire, it's autocratic, and that's being reinforced with our relations with Cuba. So what's the world like today? And the world is like what you'd expect it to be if you studied what happened to classical Greece, or you looked at what happened to Rome after the Second Punic War, why there was a Third Punic War, or you looked at what happened in the 5th century to Rome, or you looked at what happened to Byzantium. You look at anything in history, when a society feels, for a variety of reasons, that it cannot define itself, it doesn't know who it is, and therefore it's not worth defending, then you lose deterrence. And you lose deterrence by decreasing the defense budget, by contextualizing the aggression of the enemy, by using euphemisms, by insulting an enemy rather than to deter him. And the world starts to unravel, not all at once, but insidiously and gratuitously, until what was once a stable global order is gone. And so I want to leave with an admonition. I think that it was sort of preempted by the earlier talks that 2016 is going to be our 1980, and the next president who will be asked to restore deterrence is going to be as despised as he's going to find it very difficult to do. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yes.
My name is Ed Livermore.
Wait for the mic.
Yeah.
Excuse me. It's an honor to hear you, Doctor.
Thank you.
My name is Ed Livermore, and recently I completed a book by Robert Galately called Stalin's Curse, and perhaps you're aware of it. And he explained how Stalin, at the creation of the Iron Curtain countries right after the war, had packed the Balkans with Russian-speaking people. I'm wondering if that doesn't give Putin, and talking about the connections and the direct lines, if Stalin hasn't given Putin an advantage in anything he might wish to do in that region by the fact there are so many Russian-speaking people in the Balkans today, such as he used the same excuse in the Ukraine, in the eastern Ukraine.
Well, remember that it was Stalin's modus operandi, which actually he followed from Hitler, that in a particular area, and remember the Baltic states were occupied by Stalin before World War II broke out, and then they were quote unquote liberated by Hitler, and then they were reoccupied against in contrary to the promises of Stalin, who said they would be independent. But those countries have populations anywhere from 30 to 40% that are Russian. And we know that Hitler did it and Stalin did it. What usually happens is a local indigenous autonomous movement says they were being persecuted, sort of like the Sudetenland Germans, and they're being persecuted and they need help, and they just want to be liberated, they want to be free, and then some irregulars, green suit, whatever we call them, come in across the border and start to create chaos. And then the official Russian response or the official German response was, there's chaos here, nobody wants to help it. We have to come in and, like Assad did in Lebanon, we have to come in and restore order, protect the Shia population. That's what all tyrants do, and we know the book line and chapter and verse, so that's what's happening in the Baltic states. And Putin, I think, will be successful at least in one or two of them, because if that should happen in, say, September, I think most people, New York Times op-ed would be, who wants to die for Estonia? Nobody does. And if some candidate says, we're not going to die for Estonia, we're going to die so that there's not going to be Estonias everywhere, and we're going to take a short-term hit to create a long-term peace, they're going to laugh him out as a warmonger. That's just the human condition until things get so bad. The tragedy of all of this is, if you take something like World War II, it was entirely preventable. It was American isolationism, Russian collaboration with Hitler, and British appeasement. Take away those three things, and Hitler's a thug with not much of a military, and it could have been stopped in 36, 37, 38. It was stopped. When you lose deterrence, you can stop it, but it cost 60 million people. Yes? Yes. Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see it. Go ahead.
That's quite all right. Doctor, honor to have you here in Steamboat. Very, very happy to be able to hear your message, although it's not a very happy message. And that is my question. I mean, I think everybody in the room is probably of the same opinion, at least by now, if they weren't when they came this morning, that the world's in a heck of a mess. And as you said, this is probably our 1980. This election is crucial. What concerns me, and I've listened to something Mary said in the previous panel. She said that part of the magic of Reagan and the end of the Cold War was that he talked over the government and talked to the people. That's part of it, but he also was smart enough, I think, to understand that you get peace through strength.
Yeah.
And we are the trend that Peter and others have already outlined today of dismantling our military, neutering our military. That strength component appears to be in doubt. The willingness to use whatever strength we might have seems to be in doubt. And I wonder, from the standpoint of the American people, would they be willing to back another buildup, that willingness to say, don't mess with us or bad things might happen to you, that deterrence of which you're talking about. So I guess my question is, what is the solution? I think we can all map out, build up a stronger military and man up, if I can use that phrase. But are we really at a point in time culturally in the United States of America where we're willing to do that again?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. In the case of Britain, Churchill said after the Oxford Resolution that it was sordid, disgusting in comparison. He said, young blue-eyed, blonde-haired Germans are marching to the sirens of Nazism. Why, we're ashamed, and we won, and they lost World War I. So it's very, very hard to do it unless there's a national. 9/11 was something that we reacted pretty well under George Bush. The problem is that when you have leaders like a Carter or Obama, they're forced subtractors of material strength. Churchill himself was worth 10 divisions in World War II. Hitler was minus 10 divisions, his crazy decisions, especially on the Eastern Front. Obama is a forced detractor of 10 divisions in addition to the cuts, because he sent the message under no circumstances that the United States is going to be unpredictable, but it will be predictably appeasing. And so things will improve when he's no longer president. What I'm worried about, and I think you're worried about, is how are we going to get over this rough 12-month period? The next president, I mean, whatever the Republicans are saying, people, I mean, in a lot of polls, they find that more persuasive than they do what Hillary Clinton's saying, at least in matchup polls. John Bolton was right that national security is starting to worry them. Things are getting very bad in the world today. Europe, as we know it, is falling apart. I mean, imagine that a country like Germany is intellectually, spiritually incapable of saying, We can't take 1 million people in 2015, again, another million in 2016, because they're afraid of being called racist, xenophobic, insensitive, native. So it's almost paralyzed. So we've got to get over this year period, and it's going to require strong leadership. I will say in ending that I'm a little worried. The great Matthew Ridgway, who saved Korea, said the problem with socialism is that it erodes people's independence and willingness to spend money on defense. And as the entitlements for Social Security, Medicare, Medi-Cal in California, all these state programs, and the expansion of a dependency, and you have 62% labor participation rate, half the country's not paying income tax, you get the impression that it won't just be the foreign danger that we have to rally people to. It's basically saying to people, you're going to have to cut back a little bit on your pension or your food stamps or something, and that's going. And Ridgway said it was. He got in big trouble because he almost said, I didn't think we could do it in Korea, but one of the things, the tragic consequences of, we recreated the American spirit in World War II. And that's not an argument for conflict, but that's a problem. Socialism erodes national will. It really does. And we're becoming more and more socialist.
Victor?
Please don't quote me, because they'll think I was a member of the Third Reich by saying that. But I didn't mean it that way, but yes.
We know that Russia has moved material into Kaliningrad. Do we know if NATO is seriously looking at pre-positioning NATO troops in Estonia as a deterrent? Is there any serious talk of this?
There isn't, because the Eastern Europeans themselves are in a very tough position. They were allied of Hitler, and then they were promised their freedom after World War II, and they were almost without opposition incorporated into the Soviet Union. They were the wastelands of World War II. So in their way of thinking, if we're going to stop, they don't trust Putin, but if we're going to stop him, then we need mobilization on a continental-wide basis. And you look at Germany, and Germany's got it's disliked because of its fiscal discipline it's imposing on southern Mediterranean economies, its immigration problems, its lucrative trade with Putin. And I think the Europeans to the east are saying, they're sort of like the Sunni Arabs. If you really want us to do stuff and galvanize against Putin, then you got to protect us, and you got to get a lot more NATO mobilization than we, because sending a brigade to Estonia is a joke. It's worse than a joke, because it'll be overrun by the Russians, and then you'll have the wage of humiliation to be added to defeat. And so I'm very sensitive to people like Jordan, Egypt, Colombia, Israel, Hungary, Poland. All these countries are on the precipice, and the United States keeps lecturing them on what they've got to do about Putin and what they've got to do about ISIS and what they got. We don't do anything materially or psychologically or spiritually for them. Especially worried about, I'm a little off topic, but Japan and South Korea and Taiwan and the Philippines. The rule was, with the communist bloc, our guys won't get nuclear weapons. Now, if they wanted to, they could build them like Toyotas or Kias, but they won't. And your guy doesn't get nuclear weapons. North Korea got it, and then North Korea got nuclear weapons. And then every once in a while, China cuts that little leash and lets the North Korean mad dog spout off and have a test and claim it's at night. And all of our countries are there saying, okay, we don't want nuclear weapons, we can produce them, and they'll be much better than North Korea. And we keep saying to Russia and China in particular, do you want, you have Pakistan, you have Iran pretty soon, you have United States bases, do you want all these nuclear powers? Because you're going to get them, and nothing happens. So these countries will either find security with the United States, or they will go nuclear. And that's another thing we didn't talk about, but if I were a Japanese defense minister, or Australian defense minister, or Philippines defense minister, I would say to myself, I'm going to do just what Iran did, because according to the United States, you can negotiate with the United States and you won't get a bomb, and you promise not to get a bomb. So I'm just going to start enriching and get a whole nuclear weapons development plan, just like Iran. That's what Egypt should do. That's it. And we're guaranteed by the United States it can never become a nuclear deployable force. That's one of the dangers of the Iran bargain. It's a way for any country in the world to say, we want the same deal, and because you've said it won't lead to a nuclear weapon, we won't get a nuclear weapon. Why they get a nuclear weapon? So I'm really worried about the loss. One final thing is, if you've lost deterrence and you're not willing to restore it, then these incremental symbolic acts are very dangerous, such as sending a small number of troops into Estonia. You either have to do overwhelming force or not to do it at all. That's part of what our problem is with Obama bombing 75% of the missions return with the bombs on the racks, or we're going to send 500 troops into Iraq. It doesn't make sense. Yes. Yes.
Professor Hanson, my name is Bruce Albright, and I'm here in Steamboat. And as sort of a follow-up to what Bob Beaupre's answer was from you, obviously we need a change in leadership. You know, this leadership from behind clearly isn't working. We've heard about that all morning. We'll hear about that later today. And you know, the foreign policy is certainly going to be a big deal going forward. Recently, I've seen on news reports interviews, street interviews. Some of them are kind of frivolous, but for instance, they interview young people who can't identify where Iowa is on the map. They set people up to a certain degree, say, isn't it wonderful that Kim Jong-il has attained his goal and is able to, maybe you saw that spot, but able to explode a hydrogen bomb. And the young people go Kim Jong-il, that's really great, you know, I'm glad you've reached your aspiration, you know, things like that. There doesn't appear to be any range of reference with respect to history with our young people. And you may miss your flight if we get into this too deeply, but since, you know, education's been such a big part of your life and continues to be, and with your wonderful work at Hoover and what you've done at Fresno State and everywhere else, but my question specifically is, how can we restore a feeling for history? You know, people don't know about Matthew Ridgway. I think we're lucky to have had a Petraeus among the savior generals in this generation, because I think we've had political generals, just like they had in Rome toward the end. And I am concerned that the American populace has lost its ability, or more fundamentally, its interest in history, and its ability, like I said, have this range of reference. I think it was John Adams who said, I study politics and war so my children can study architecture and art and philosophy, and my grandchildren can study, you know, other things. I'm afraid people are taking that too literally, and meaning you can study software and social change at the expense of politics and history, not in addition. So,
well, I understand what you're worried about, because 30% of the university curriculum is therapeutic. It has the hyphenated studies, environmental studies, leisure studies, Chicano studies, Asian studies, community studies. Anything with studies is basically worthless. The Greeks told us that there was philosophy and math and science and language, and that was about it. Now we've sliced up that thing into all of these popular culture things that anybody can absorb by watching television. So one of the most embarrassing, I've had a couple of embarrassing moments when I was farming and I went back and I had to give a lecture to be hired, and it was on the West, decline and fall of the West, and when I started talking, half of the students got up because they thought I was going to talk about Westerns. And then in my humanities class, I'd always say, I'm going to get 250 terms for you guys, so you at least have a common body of knowledge, because that's all education is. Two things: you have to have an inductive method, so you're not deductive. You don't have preconceived ideas and make facts fit, but you have facts, and then from the facts you come to an inductive conclusion, but we have to also have the facts. So I think it was Cultural Literacy by Hirsch had a little appendix, so there were words like ionic order, or de rigueur, or the White House, or the Brandenburg Gate, whatever. I had them and I memorized them, and it worked wonderfully. These guys had a body of knowledge. I gave a test on it, and the Chicano Studies person called me up and said, why are you indoctrinating our students with this meaningless? And I said, I will continue the conversation if you let me pick two things from the list and you can tell me what they were. I picked 5 and he didn't know one. So The problem is that we have a therapeutic community. It's not, and everybody knows it. Journalists you don't need a BA to do much because the BA is lost its value. It's very expensive, but it does not guarantee somebody thinks inductively or reads and writes well. It's a tragedy, but it's entirely predictable. You take a kid, and he's only got 3 to 4 hours a night and 3 or 4 hours in the day to study, and you carve off that critical time and say, you're going to study Chicano lowriding in LA during the Zoot riots, and then you're going to go to the next class and study global warming with the Al Gore video, and then you're going to go to the next class and study aerobic exercising in the suburb, and there's no time for anything else. And so we get that Jesse Waters Fox stuff is what, and finally, I can say that if we'd asked people in 1941 where the Philippines were, I don't think many people would have known. We've been here before. It's always it goes back to Aristophanes. It's a indictment of democracy and capitalism that we create leisure and affluence and a undisciplined citizen who's ignorant, and then when a war comes, they really step on it. And I don't know at some point whether technology or the 21st century postmodernism means that we can't do that anymore. I do know that when you try to arrest what you're worried about, most academics and most professors, they do this, and they say there's 3% traditionalists on campus. If I teach a traditional class and I say the Aztecs engaged in mass murder just as much as Cortez, I'm going to get complaints. Do I want complaints? If I write this article and I attack Castro, do I really want to deal with this? So in academia, it's sort of like you buy an insurance policy. It's an indemnity. So that's way in our popular culture. If you're a celebrity, an intellectual, you're an artist, an actor, you say, I'm going to mouth politically correct nonsense because if I make a mistake, I don't want to end up like Paula Deen or Duck Dynasty or Serling. I have an insurance policy. So if I'm Chris Rock, I can say Happy White People's Day. Or if I'm Joe Biden, I can say he's a great candidate, he's clean, and he speaks like a white person. And I'm insured against it. And that explains why these things continue, because the left has made this adversarial culture. And they, speaking of deterrence, they're experts at it. Not where it counts, but in the culture wars, they deter all of us. They say, we have established this linguistic kingdom, and this is the way the rules are. And if you dare try to say something, we're going to demonize and destroy you. Barack Obama got started as a community organizer who went to the bank official's home and yelled at them across the yard. And so people understand they're human and they react to pressure. That's why what you guys are doing is so good, because you're trying to restore deterrence and tell people in the larger community you don't have to apologize anymore. And if we keep going, you can see where the Trump candidacy is feeding from. If I talk to a Trump supporter, they say, I don't care what he says. I like what he says, and I like the way he says it. And that's all I care about. I don't care if it's incoherent. I don't care if he offends people. I like what he represents, the spirit. And Obama was Dr. Frankenstein, and Trump was his monster, in a way.
Professor, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, a huge amount of excellent information, very helpful, very distressing at the one hand, but at least you're spelling it out the way it is. With the cost of war, both financially and in terms of the lives of people and in terms of the incredible capacity that all of these countries have now for destruction, in your opinion, is there no chance at all of elevating the discussion, elevating diplomacy and negotiation amongst leaders, at least to the point where we say, well, peace means not the complete removal of all of the differences, but peace means the cooperative management of our differences. Yeah. Do we have any chance of rising to that, or is it just simply going to be war, death, cost, and that's the way it's going to be forever?
Well, maybe put it this way. You take the most sophisticated suburb in Denver, among the most highly educated people, And you take something trivial, which Thucydides says represents honor, fear, or self-interest, which he thought causes wars. But let's say a very wealthy doctor in a Denver suburb and a very wealthy lawyer are best friends. One has a Mercedes, one has a BMW. And one day, one of their trees is a little bit too far over the edge, and the leaves clutter up one man's gutter. Are they going to peaceably sort that out? They're both educated, they're wealthy. They're going to go, you know what, I will cut off 1/8 of that limb and then you'll pay the, and I don't think so. Because I look at the small claims court and either they shoot each other, they sue each other, or they're arguing, or they don't speak to each other. The point I'm getting at is that the human condition is unchanged. Human nature doesn't change. Now you can ameliorate some of the distasteful things, but I support the UN in the sense you should be able to air grievances and talk it out, and that helps. But we do have a paradigm from history going back 2,500 years in the West that humans are no damn good. And they're capable at any time of almost anything. Not all of them, but a sizable minority of them. And to protect the majority, you need deterrence. But the problem is that anybody who says that is not progressive. He doesn't believe in the powers of technology. He doesn't think brain chemistry is evolving. He doesn't think genetics. The progressives were big on that. And so the problem is that you have to have a Neanderthal view of the world and say, you know what, in any given room like this, 10% of these people are no damn good. And we have to create a legal system that makes it, we have to shame them. We've got to have a penal system. We've got to deter them, and they won't do it. And then we've got to have a system of rewards for people who do not commit crimes or given awards, outstanding Rotarian of the, all of that's what society is. But when you, this is what's so hard now, when you fool yourself, like people did after Versailles, I know that because the classicists were the ringleaders, Gilbert Murray and Alfred Zimmern, all these wonderful people of Greece and Rome, and they said, we need a new Olympic Games to change the way people think. So after the Versailles Treaty, we're going to outlaw Kellogg-Briand, outlaw war, we're going to have Locarno, we're going to do all these wonderful things. But the problem is, they didn't solve the problem that 10% of people, a Hitler, a Goering, a Mussolini, a Tojo, they're no good. And you have to find ways to punish them. And most importantly, most of us don't have strong views. We react to what we feel are winners and losers. So 1939, you can't find one person in Germany who ever said he didn't like Hitler. They all loved him. 1945 in June, you couldn't find one person who said he ever supported Hitler. What changed? They lost and were humiliated. It's like the 49ers. When they're 0-10, you can't find a 49er fan in the Bay Area. When they're 10-0, everybody says that they were the first 49er fan in the world. So society's responsibility is to create rewards and punishment against aggressors and peace lovers, and then keep sort of a, it's not going to, I mean, there's always going to be a Noriega, a Milosevic. It's like cutting your lawn every day. And people in the post-war for 70 years, Americans, Harry Truman, JFK, Bill Clinton, I'm mentioning Democrats. They said, you know what, I got to get up and mow the lawn today. So there might be a guy in Grenada, there might be a guy in Panama, Noriega, but they took care of business. And it wasn't perfect. They didn't feel they had to be perfect to be good. But they said, this is the post-war order, and globalization is the dividend, and we're all getting prosperous, and people in the Amazon have antibiotics, and this is a great, but we do have to keep a lid on it. And then we got a guy who comes in and says, human nature can be wonderful. You know, I was at Occidental, I was at Columbia, I was at Harvard, I'm a community organizer, I can change the way, hope and change. And it was Carter to the nth degree. And now we're paying a terrible price. So the amorality, we got to get that straight. The amorality, or with utopians, they're really a nasty bunch that don't care about individual humans. And the morality is with people like Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Truman and people like that. But they don't win that accord in their own time. I'm sorry I went on too long. Go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Hanson, Rick Fisher from Steamboat, but as the expert, could you give us your top 5 deterrents and what they would be in a world?
What we would do now?
Yes. Or
yes.
in the future as it evolves, so that we have something we can help support.
Yeah, what I would do right now is I would sit down with the budget and I would address the tax code entitlement so I could spend 4% GDP on defense. Number two, I would fire anybody who tried to engage in euphemisms. And that's the same. I would use the word radical Islam, and more importantly, I would at the same time tell my diplomatic team, you do not insult a thug unless you want to go to war with them. There's not going to be any macho shtick or cut up. These are serious dangers, and be very careful what you say. And then number three, I would get our allies in, and I'd say, you may not be the nicest guys in the world, but you're on our team, and you're better than the alternative. And what you need, and how do we invest, and we're going to be on the same team. And these are the bad guys, and we're not going to let them encroach on your territory or your space. And then I would tell the American people that we have a post-war order. It was pretty good, Democrat and Republican. We tried to deviate it from it twice with Jimmy Carter and Obama, and they almost blew the world up. And that's what we're trying to do. And we should, it's very simple. Would it happen? No. We forget that when Reagan came into office, he did just what I said. And how did the Americans react for the first 2 years? They produced TV shows called The Morning After about nuclear winter. That word came out, nuclear winter. Suddenly Reagan was a nuclear winter guy. And it was terrible. And Reagan wasn't great on everything, but he did get us back to that mindset. And it made us safer and made the world safer. Thank you. Thank you.
Just quick.
Hi, Natalie Brighting, originally from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I moved here to Steamboat 1.5 years ago. Love it. Just want to say, first of all, I just recently did some research in order to do a presentation at the elementary school this year, or last year, on Veterans Day. And part of my, the information that I pulled up was new statistics on our military. How many people, how many men and women are serving currently on active duty. And I was personally disturbed to find out that less than 1% of our entire population in the United States is currently serving in the military. When you think of that number, and I would like to find out, if you know exact numbers of, China, for example, they're building theirs up. What's their numbers or their percentage of numbers compared to their population? But do you see another draft coming is my question, based on where we're at right now and what's happening?
Well, I think the arguments against a draft are entirely, and conservatives make them as well, they're entirely based on technical issues. So the cohort between 18 and 25, for example, is huge. It's about 30 million people. So when you have a draft and everybody registers, the military can use maybe 2 or 3 million of them. But what do you do with the other people? If we were to have 2 tracks like the last 3 countries in Europe, I think there's only 3 left that have a draft. The problem is if we say, we need 3 million of you people to be in the military so you can mix up culturally, socially, rich and poor, great, I am all for that. But we don't have enough space for everybody. So some of you can work at hospitals or build roads, civilian. The problem is everybody self-selects. So you look at the European evidence, everybody who's the left goes to the social thing, and the poor and the conservatives go to the military. So it doesn't solve the problem, which was to mix up people of different backgrounds and culture into public service. So I'm worried about that. The other thing is, as we become highly technological, you want somebody in the military more than 2 years to learn the sophisticated hardware. So what I'm worried about is the arguments that you are suggesting are time-honored. They're good arguments, that every society needs civic militarism, that everybody has a stake in society. The problem is that the way that we're so huge now, we have to, the proponents of a draft do not say, and they should, we need this many million people. This is how many would be eligible for draft. Here's how you would select one person arbitrarily by a lottery, and then the 9 out of 10 people are not going to be drafted. Well, we can only use 3 million for every 2 years, so most people who register for the draft will not be drafted. We can have alternative service, but we must recognize that they will self-select because they like to, plant trees rather than shoot a gun. And that's where we are right now, as I see it. And the other thing is, a lot of people say, well, you shouldn't be, you shouldn't comment on something unless you've been in the military. And there's something to that. I did a debate, and I wasn't in the military. And my father flew 40 missions on a B-29. I'm named after Victor Hanson was killed on Okinawa, so I felt that, because I was farming during those years. And then, as I said to somebody who made that argument, we have to be very careful about it, because I said, well, why would I ever believe you about food policy? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, you should not ever talk about calorie intake, food, or anything, because you never farmed. You know how to drive a tractor? Do you know what a tandem disc is? You know how to calibrate a spray rig? Farming is the most dangerous occupation. It has a higher accident rate than the military. You see where we go when we get into that argument. So that people who are steel workers, people who are coal miners, there's some nasty, dirty jobs in the United States besides the military. So I worry a little bit that people in the military sometimes say that nobody can talk about defense or we all have to be in the military. I think that's a traditionally, historically valid point, but we also have to realize that what keeps this country going are a lot of forgotten people who engage in muscular, dangerous, dirty work, and they get no credit. When I get up in the morning on my farm and I see the guy that comes in on the tractor, I see a guy whose hand is just completely destroyed from an accident. I see somebody who never made over $30,000 a year. I see somebody who can tell me A to Z about the physiology of plum trees and could write a thesis on it, and yet I see somebody who's uneducated with no retirement. The society thinks is an idiot because he's not educated, and people in the military might think he avoided military service because he never. So I'm very sensitive to all these muscular jobs. And I think, again, getting back to Trump, that's one of the reasons that Trump resonates. How he does it is a multi-millionaire prep school billionaire from New York, and he appeals to blue-collar people is a commentary on the Republican establishment.
Victor,
Yep.
this will be the last question,
Yeah.
but I also just want to say that you have not disappointed. Everybody was so excited to hear you.
Thank
and
you.
Boy, we've been delighted. The last question is, despite what Peter said, I believe he said that there's at least one thing that the Chinese are higher than we are when it comes to technology. Basically, our technology in the military, in the Pentagon, seems to be above everyone else's at this point. Could this be, knowing how bureaucratic the Pentagon is, and certainly not backing up the disintegration of the military by Obama, but is there a case to be made for our spending a lot less on fighting the last wars, such as having a lot more ships, et cetera, because our technology may be able to take the place?
Yeah, I think that's the technology. There's two force multipliers of military force traditionally in history. One is leadership, and the other is technology. So just to give you one example, the United States goes into the war on December 7th. It has 40 million people less than the Soviet Union, who's a third of it's under occupation. Britain has been geared up for war. And so the United States fields the second largest military, 12 million people, only 100,000 smaller than the Soviets. The United States produced more military hardware, ships, tanks, artillery, than all of the other combatants combined, and along with Britain, the most technologically sophisticated. And so what that meant was the two countries in World War II that had the greatest technology and the greatest leadership were Churchill's England, Britain, and Roosevelt's America. And here's the clincher. They won the war relatively quickly, given the odds against them, and they suffered the fewest number of casualties for the population. And that was because of things like British radar, British sonar, Sten machine guns, American Essex carriers, Missouri battleships, M1 carbines, but most importantly, GMC trucks, Jeeps, oil production. So absolutely, technology and leadership can nullify manpower and courage. The Axis, when we were doing all this along with Britain, what were the Axis saying, Mussolini saying, Tojo saying, Hitler? Spiritual purity. martial order will always win. One German soldier can kill 7 on the Eastern Front. That's true, but for them to win, they had to kill 14, and they couldn't. So you're absolutely right. Technology and leadership can make up for material deficits. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.